she built a wet furnace. Peter Moen, who had hauled freight through 12 prairie winters and pulled a family alive from a snow-buried dugout, told her plainly, "When the real cold comes, that trick will kill you and the girl beside you." $32, a 12-year-old sister, and no way to buy the 6 cords she needed before freeze-up. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 6 hours. But 5 months earlier, Ragna Tveit had never built a heating system or kept a cabin through a single plains winter. She had arrived in Dakota Territory in August of 1887 with a husband who could lift a plow frame by himself and $32 that was supposed to last until the first crop paid. The husband was dead before the wheat came in. A wagon upset during harvest. Hauling caught him under the sideboard and crushed his chest, and by the time the neighbor's boy rode for help, he had stopped breathing in the stubble of a field that did not belong to them yet. Ragna Tveit buried him on a Tuesday. She was 26 years old. She had a 12-year-old sister named Eli who was not her daughter, but might as well have been, because their parents were dead in Norway and no one else was coming. She had a half-finished cabin, 16 by 20 feet, with chinks wide enough to pass daylight through. She had a small cast-iron box stove that could heat the air 3 feet in every direction and no further. She had 1 pony, 1 milk cow, 1.5 cords of green cottonwood, and a filing claim that would revert to nothing if she left it. The filing fee was already spent. The improvements were already made. Walking away meant losing everything they had paid in labor and cash and grief, and walking away to where? She had no relatives in the territory. She had no money for eastbound passage. She had a debt on the claim, and a child to feed, and a winter coming that did not care about any of it. The cabin sat on open prairie east of the De Smet corridor, where the nearest tree line was a wagon ride away, and the wind came from the northwest without anything to slow it down. The land was flat in a way that made distance meaningless. You could see weather coming for an hour and still not outrun it. Eli asked once, the week after the burial, whether they would go back. Ragna told her there was no back. Back was a ship they could not afford to board, in a country where the farm that raised them had already been sold to pay their father's debts. Back was a word for people with choices. They had the claim, they had the cabin, they had the $32 and the coming cold, and that was the whole of it. The first man to tell her she would die was not cruel about it. That was the worst part. Peter Moen arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, driving a livery wagon with a broken spoke he had been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. He was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders from a decade of freight hauling before he bought the livery in town, and he had survived 12 prairie winters without losing a finger or a child. He had pulled a family out of a snow-buried dugout in 1882. He had driven a dead man's team back to town in 1884 after the cold took the driver, somewhere between the river crossing and the granary road. When Peter Moen told you something about winter, you listened, because the things he knew had cost other people their lives. He walked the claim the way a doctor walks a sickbed. Slow, quiet, looking at things he did not want to see. He checked the woodpile first. Ragna watched him count the splits, tap the ends, and pull a piece from the middle to smell the grain. Green cottonwood, Peter said. He set the piece back. 1.5 cords, maybe less. Ragna said she knew. You need 6 cords minimum for a bad winter. 8 if the railroad stalls and you can't get coal. He looked at the cabin. That stove of yours, what is it, a number 7 box? Number 6. Peter walked to the north wall and pressed his hand flat against the boards. He held it there for 3 seconds, and then pulled it away. I can feel wind through this. You've got chinks open enough to lose half your heat before it reaches the far wall. He crouched and looked at the foundation line where the sill met the ground. No banking, no sod against the base. The frost will come up through the floor by November. He stood and looked at her, not with contempt, with the careful patience of a man who had seen this arithmetic before and knew how it ended. You have half a frame, Peter said. You have maybe 1.5 cords of wood that will burn wet and smoke worse. You have a stove that heats a circle the size of a washtub. You have no coal contract, no second team to haul with, and no hired man to cut with. He paused. You can burn all day in that little iron box and still wake with ice in the wash basin. I know what I have, Ragna said. Do you know what happens when it goes to 30 below? 40 below? Pater's voice did not rise. The cold does not negotiate. It does not care that you filed a claim or that you have a girl in there who needs you alive. It comes through every crack you haven't filled, and it takes the warm air out of that room like you pulled a plug from a tub. And that stove will not keep up. Not that stove. Not in that cabin. Not with 1.5 cords. Ragna said nothing. When the real cold comes, Pater said, that trick will kill you and the girl beside you. He was not talking about a trick yet. There was no trick. He was talking about the cabin itself, the whole arrangement, the idea that a woman with a box stove and a cord and a half of green wood could survive a plains winter alone. But the word settled in the air like a judgment that would wait for its subject. Pater offered to help her find work in town. He said he knew a woman who needed kitchen help and that Eli could attend the school if they boarded near the church. He said this without embarrassment, as a practical man offering a practical solution, and Ragna understood that he meant it kindly. He was telling her to abandon the claim before the claim killed her. She told him no. He looked at her for a long time. Then he climbed back on his wagon and drove away without fixing the spoke. That night, Ragna sat at the table with the lamp turned low and counted the money again. $32. Coal in town cost more than she could haul, and hauling cost more than she had. Cordwood from the river breaks ran $4 a cord if you cut it yourself, and $7 if someone cut it for you, but she had no saw worth the name, and the nearest stand of decent timber was a full day's ride each way with the pony pulling. 6 cords at $4 was $24, which left 8 for everything else until spring, nails, flour, salt, lamp oil, feed for the animals, medicine if Eli got sick. $8 for 6 months. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. She could buy 3 cords and pray for a mild winter. She could burn cow chips and twisted hay the way some families did, and live in a cabin that smelled like a stable fire. She could tear the unfinished addition apart and burn the lumber, which would give her heat for maybe 2 weeks and leave her with a smaller cabin and no material for spring building. None of it worked. Every path she calculated ended in the same place. Not enough fuel, not enough heat, not enough time. Eli was asleep on the cot near the stove, curled under a quilt that was already too thin. Ragna could see the girl's breath in the lamplight. She did not have an idea yet. She had a problem that every experienced person on the plains would have solved the same way. More wood, more fire, more fuel, and she could not afford any of it. The idea came from a kettle. 3 days after Pater's visit, Ragna heated wash water on the stove for laundry. She filled the big iron kettle, set it on the stovetop, and waited. When the water was hot enough, she lifted the kettle off and set it on the floor near the wash tub. She washed. She wrung. She hung the clothes on a line strung across the cabin's south wall. The work took the better part of an hour. When she went to dump the wash water, she touched the kettle out of habit to check if it had cooled. It had not. The water inside was still hot enough to sting her fingers. The stove beside it had already lost its edge. The iron box cooled fast once she stopped feeding it, the way it always did, the way every small stove on the plains did. But the kettle full of water stayed warm. She stood there with her hand on the kettle and remembered. Her father, in the kitchen of the house in Norway, pressing her palm against a stone he had pulled from the oven shelf. She was 9. The stove had gone out an hour before, and the room was cooling, but the stone still held heat. He put her other hand against the cold wall and said, "The hottest thing in a room is not always the flame. Feel that. Stone remembers heat the way wood forgets it." He had said it in the way he said most things, as if he were telling her a small secret the world had already published but nobody bothered to read. The stone was about retention. The kettle was about retention. The stove was about production. Production without retention was waste, and waste on the prairie was death. She thought about it for 2 days before she said it aloud. She said it to Eli, who was scraping dried mud from the pony's hoof near the lean-to. Water holds heat longer than iron. Eli looked up. So? So what if the stove did not just heat the air? What if the stove heated water and the water held the heat, and the heat came out slow all night, even after the fire went down? Eli thought about this. Where would you put the water? Around the stove, in something big enough to hold enough water to matter. Big like what? Ragna did not answer right away, because the answer was the part that sounded impossible. She needed a vessel large enough to surround the stove, strong enough to hold water at high temperature without splitting, and available on a prairie where building materials cost money she did not have. She found it 4 days later. A broken traction engine sat in a field 2 miles south of the claim, near a machine yard where a threshing outfit had abandoned equipment after a boiler failure the previous summer. Steam engines were common enough on the plains by then, big iron machines that powered threshers and hauled freight, and when they broke down far from a foundry, they sometimes stayed where they fell. The engine was ruined. The drive mechanism was seized. The firebox had cracked. But the boiler shell, the big riveted cylinder that had once held pressurized steam, was intact. 8 feet long and nearly 4 feet across, riveted mild steel, heavier than anything she could lift alone. The owner of the machine yard, a man who owed Ragna's dead husband for harvest work never settled, let her have the shell for the debt. He thought she wanted it for a stock trough. She did not correct him. She spent 2 days figuring how to get it home. The pony could not drag it. She borrowed a neighbor's ox team for a half day in exchange for mending a harness, and she and Eli skidded the shell on cottonwood poles like a log sled. It took 4 hours to move it 2 miles. When they rolled it off the poles next to the cabin, Ragna sat on the ground and looked at it and tried to see what it would become. A stove inside a water tank. The fire heats the stove. The stove heats the water. The water heats the room. Slowly, all night, after the fire dies. It sounded like madness even inside her own head. The first person to tell her it was madness out loud was Marte Nischheim, who lived on the next claim south, and who was the closest thing Ragna had to a friend in the territory. Marte was practical and kind and had survived 2 winters with a husband who drank too much and worked too little, and she had done it by knowing exactly how much of everything she needed and never wasting a scrap. She came over when she saw the boiler shell sitting beside the cabin, and she walked around it once with her arms folded before she spoke. That's a boiler shell off a traction engine. It is. And you're going to do what with it? Ragna explained. The stove goes inside the shell. The chimney pipe goes up through a collar in the top. The shell fills part way with water. The water takes the heat from the stove and the shell wall, and the shell radiates it into the room after the fire drops. Not a sealed system, vented, an overflow bucket, and a fill hatch and head space so the water can expand without building pressure. Marte listened to all of it. Then she said, "You're spending wood to warm water when you don't even have enough wood to warm yourself. The water holds the heat after the wood is gone. That's the point." How do you know? Because a kettle full of water stays hot an hour after the stove goes cold. The stove forgets heat. Water remembers it. Marte looked at the shell again. That thing weighs more than your pony. How will you get it inside? I'll cut the door wider and build a ramp. And if it leaks, then I'll fix the seams. And if it bursts, or boils over, or cracks the floorboards from the weight, I'll lay stone under it. Ragna. Marte's voice dropped the way it did when she was no longer arguing a point, but pleading against a danger she could see clearly. Every gallon of water in that thing is 8 more pounds on your floor, and 8 more pounds the stove has to heat before the room gets any of it. You're making the problem worse. You're adding weight you can't move and mass you can't heat fast enough. Every piece of wood you burn, warming that water is a piece of wood you're not using to warm the air your sister breathes. And every piece of wood I burn warming the air disappears in 20 minutes because the cabin leaks and the stove is too small. I'm not losing fuel. I'm storing it. Marte shook her head. She was not angry. She was frightened. She had watched families fail on the plains, and the ones who failed worst were the ones who bet everything on a clever idea instead of doing the hard, boring, proven work of cutting wood, hauling coal, and stuffing chinks. I hope you're right, Marte said, because if you're wrong, you will have wasted 3 weeks building something that doesn't work, and you'll be 3 weeks shorter on wood and 3 weeks closer to the cold. She left. Ragna stood beside the boiler shell and put her hand against the rusted steel. It was cold. Everything on the prairie was cold, or getting there. She admitted the dangers to herself because lying about them would not change them. If a seam leaked, the water would flood the cabin floor, and she would have to drain, dry, and reseal before trying again. If she overfired and the water approached boiling, the steam could scald. If the stoveplate warped from sustained contact with the shell, she would lose her only heat source entirely. If the whole system simply did not retain enough heat to matter, she would have burned weeks in wood on a failure. She wagered her labor against the physics. One evening's fire buying 1 full night of survivable warmth. It was the only bet she could afford to make. It was also the only bet that might work. Torsten Vik heard about the boiler shell before Ragnar got it through the door. Torsten ran the general store and fuel supply in town. He was not a large man, but he had a large voice and a sharp eye for weakness, and he had built his business on the certainty that settlers needed things they could not provide for themselves. He sold coal at rates that reflected distance, scarcity, and desperation in roughly equal measure, and he extended credit at terms that made the credit more dangerous than the cold. Families that bought on Torsten's terms in October frequently owed him the value of their improvements by March. Some of them signed over claims rather than carry the debt. Torsten did not force anyone to buy. He simply made sure the alternative looked like dying. If Ragna Tveit proved that a family could survive a winter on less purchased fuel, then every claim within wagon distance would want to know how, and every cord and every bushel of coal that Ragnar's method displaced was money Torsten would not collect. He came to the claim on a day when Ragnar was hauling the shell toward the cabin on skids. Eli was at the back end, bracing with a stick, and the pony was straining at the front, and neither of them saw Torsten until he was standing 10 feet away with his hat pushed back and his hands in his coat pockets. "That's a sight," Torsten said. "A traction boiler on skids. You planning to run a threshing outfit, or are you building a still?" "Neither." "I heard you're putting a stove inside it, filling it with water, heating your cabin with a steam bath." He smiled. Neighbors talk. Ragna did not stop working. Neighbors always talk. Coal is $2 a bushel on 30-day terms. I can have it delivered by Friday. That cabin needs 3 deliveries to get through the winter. $6 up front, the rest against the claim. He said this casually, the way he said everything that had a hook in it. "I don't need coal. You have 1.5 cords of green cottonwood and a claim you can't heat. You need coal or you need a miracle, and I don't stock miracles. I don't need credit either." Torsten's smile faded by 1 degree. "Pride is expensive on the prairie, Mrs. Tveit. Your husband found that out. Smart people take help when it's offered." Ragna set down the skid rope and looked at him directly for the first time. Your help has a lien attached. I've seen the terms. I'll keep my pride in my deed, thank you. Marte, who had come over to help brace the shell, stood behind the boiler and said nothing. Peter was not there, but his absence felt like its own verdict, a man who had already written her off and gone home. Torsten looked at the boiler shell. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Eli, who had stopped bracing and was watching him with the flat expression of a child who has learned not to trust men who smile while talking about money. When that thing doesn't work, Torsten said, and you need heat you can't cut or carry, my door's open. The terms won't improve. He turned and walked to his horse without waiting for an answer. That afternoon, while Ragna and Eli levered the shell up the ramp and through the widened door frame, she could hear the phrase already spreading through the scattered claims like smoke. She's trying to drown a stove and call it winter wood. The drowning stove, the wet furnace, the boiler house widow. The words came back through Marte, through the man at the machine yard, through the boy who delivered mail to the crossroads. Ragna heard them all. She kept working. If she failed, she would confirm every assumption Torsten counted on, that a woman alone on a claim was a defaulting deed waiting to happen, that immigrant stubbornness was the same as immigrant stupidity, that every family on the plains needed his coal and his credit and his terms. If she failed, the cabin would revert, and Torsten would know exactly what it was worth, because he had already said so in front of witnesses. The shell was inside the cabin now, sitting on bare floorboards that groaned under the weight. Ragna needed stone for a foundation, brick for a fire shield, clay for ceiling, and someone who knew how riveted steel behaved under heat. She had none of those things. She had October, and October on the Dakota Plains was not a month. It was a warning. She found the help she needed in a smithy that smelled like burnt iron and linseed oil. Aslak Brekka was 58, Norwegian by birth, lame in the left hip from a forge accident 15 years earlier, and quiet in the way that large men are sometimes quiet when they have learned that the world does not require them to explain themselves. He had come to Dakota to shoe horses and mend plows, but before that he had worked as a boilermaker's helper on the river, fitting and testing the riveted shells that held steam in the engines that pushed cargo upstream. He knew steel the way Ragna's father had known stone, from the inside, by touch and sound, and the particular ring a hammer made against a seam that was holding versus a seam that was ready to give. Ragna went to his smithy because she needed a chimney collar fabricated, a steel ring that would let the stovepipe pass through the top of the boiler shell without leaking. She brought a paper template she had cut and measured herself, and Aslak looked at the template for a long time before he looked at her. "This is for a boiler shell," he said. "It is." "And you're running a stovepipe through it." "I am." "And the shell will have water in it." "Yes." Aslak set the template down. "Where did you get a boiler shell?" she told him. He nodded slowly, the way he did everything. "Your seams," he said. "The riveted seams on that shell. Have you tested them?" "I don't know how." "Then you don't know if they'll hold water at temperature. And if they don't hold, you've got a cabin full of hot water and a stove sitting in a puddle with nowhere for the steam to go." He paused. "That's not a heating problem. That's a killing problem." "That's why I need the collar done right." Aslak looked at her again. Not the way Peter had looked, measuring the distance to failure, and not the way Torsten had looked, calculating the profit in her desperation. Aslak looked at her the way a man looks at a joint someone has cut cleanly for the first time. He was reading the template. He was seeing the measurements, the allowances, the fact that she had accounted for expansion around the pipe. She had done the thinking. She had done it wrong in a few places, but she had done it. "The idea is not mad," Aslak said, but the way you've drawn it will scald someone or flood your floor within a week. You need venting. You need overflow. You need to know which seams will weep at temperature and peen them before you fill. And you need to never, ever seal that shell closed. Heated water expands. Trapped steam builds pressure. A sealed vessel at temperature is a bomb. You understand? I understand. I will make your collar, Aslak said. And I will teach you to test the seams and set the venting. I'm not building it for you. I'm showing you how steel works at heat so that you can build it yourself without killing the girl. Why? Because you measured before you asked. That is not a common thing. He charged her $1.50 for the collar and nothing for the teaching. Over the next 2 weeks, in sessions stolen between his regular work and her chores, he showed her the first skill she needed, how to find a weak seam. He gave her a piece of chalk and a small hammer and taught her to tap along every rivet line, listening for the dull thud that meant the steel was seated tight versus the higher ring that meant a gap was forming. He showed her how to chalk the suspect spots, fill the shell with a few inches of cold water, and watch for the dark stain of a weep. He showed her how to heat a seam with a torch made from a twisted rag and tallow, then peen the rivets while the steel was warm enough to move but not hot enough to warp. It was precise work. It was slow. It required patience she did not have and time she could not afford. And every evening she walked back to the cabin in fading light and saw the boiler shell sitting there like a promise or a coffin, and she did not know which. The first frost came in the 3rd week of October. She could see it on the inside of the window glass when she woke. Eli's breath was visible from the cot. If you have ever had everyone around you say the thing you were building would never work, tell us about it in the comments. Because Ragna Tveit was running out of time, and the only people who believed in the wet furnace were a girl who was 12 and a blacksmith who had not seen it finished. The temperature was dropping. The cottonwood was still green. The seams were half tested. The collar was not yet fitted, and the shell still sat on bare floorboards without a stone foundation, without a vent pipe, without water. Aslak told her the next lesson, draft control, the art of managing how fast and how hot the fire burned inside the shell, would take another week to practice safely. She did not have another week. She had October, and October was already leaving. Aslak taught her draft control on a morning when the wind shifted south and the air smelled like turned earth instead of frost. He came to the cabin with a tin sheet he had cut into a damper plate and a length of stovepipe he had pulled from a scrap pile behind the livery. "Your chimney pulls air through the firebox," he said. He held the damper plate near the stove's intake vent, while a small test fire burned inside the shell. The faster the pull, the hotter the burn. The hotter the burn, the faster you use wood. On an open stove, you want pull. You want the room hot now because the room forgets now. But you are not heating a room. You are heating water. Water does not need fast heat. Water needs slow heat, steady heat, heat that goes into the mass and stays. He slid the damper halfway closed. The fire dropped from a crackling rush to a low murmur. The chimney pipe above the collar stopped shuddering. "Feel the shell," he said. Ragna put her hand against the steel. It was warm, not hot. Warm the way the kettle had been warm, the way the stone in her father's hand had been warm. Heat that was moving inward instead of escaping upward. "That is what you want," Aslak said. "A fire that lasts 4 hours at half draw instead of 2 hours at full. The wood goes further, the water goes hotter, and the room gets the heat later from the tank, not from the stove. You're not burning a fire, you're charging a battery." He did not use that word. He said filling a well. But the principle was the same, and Ragna understood it the way she understood debt, as a thing that accumulated whether you watched it or not. They practiced damper positions for 3 days. Full open for starting. 3/4 for the first hour when the water was still cold and the steel needed to expand evenly. Half for the long burn. Quarter for overnight banking when the coals were deep and the water was already at temperature. Ragna learned to read the fire by the sound of the chimney. A high whistle meant too much draw. A soft hum meant the draft was seated right. And silence meant the fire was dying or the flue was blocked. The third lesson came the following week, and it was the one Aslak cared about most. I have shown you how to find bad seams and how to control the fire, he said. Now I will show you the thing that will kill you if you forget it. He brought a small sealed tin can. He set it on the forge coals with water inside. They watched. In 3 minutes, the can bulged. In 4, it split at the solder line and sprayed hot water across the anvil face. That can had no vent, Aslak said. The water heated. The water expanded. The steam had nowhere to go. The pressure found the weakest point and blew through it. He picked up the split can and held it in front of her face. Your shell is bigger. Your water is more. Your fire is hotter. If you seal that shell and fire it, you're not building a heater. You are building a boiler, and a boiler without a relief valve is a cannon. Ragna stared at the split seam. Never seal the fill hatch, Aslak said. Never block the vent pipe. Never cap the overflow. If steam is coming out the vent, that is the system working. If steam stops coming out the vent while the fire is still burning, something is blocked, and you pull the fire immediately. You rake the coals out onto the stone, and you open every hatch until the pressure drops. Do you understand? I understand. Say it back to me. Never seal it. Never block the vent. If the vent goes quiet while the fire is on, pull the fire. Good. Aslak set the split can on the bench. Keep that. Put it where you can see it from the stove. When you are tired and it is cold and you think closing the hatch will hold more heat in, look at the can. She kept it. She nailed it to the wall beam above the fill hatch, where it hung like a small tin warning for the rest of the winter. The construction took longer than the weather allowed. In the first week of November, Ragna and Eli laid the stone foundation. They hauled field stone from a creek bed 2 miles east, loading the pony's panniers with as much as the animal could carry without stumbling. Each trip brought enough stone for 1 course of the pad. The pad needed 4 courses to support the weight of the shell full of water. Ragna calculated roughly 2,000 pounds at capacity, and the floorboards would not hold that without a stone footing underneath. They dug through the floor, set the stone on packed earth, mortared the gaps with clay and ash, and leveled the top with a board and a carpenter's bubble that Aslak lent her. It took 6 days. By the end, Ragna's hands were cracked from the clay. Her shoulder ached from the hauling, and Eli had a blister on her right heel that she tried to hide by not limping when Ragna was watching. Then the stove went inside the shell. This was the heaviest work. The cast iron box stove weighed close to 100 pounds empty, and it had to be lifted over the shell's cut-out access mouth and settled on fire brick at the bottom of the cylinder. Ragna and Eli could not manage it alone. Aslak came on a Sunday afternoon and brought a lever bar and a pair of chain hooks, and the 3 of them walked the stove up a plank ramp and down into the shell 1 inch at a time. Aslak's bad hip made him grimace on every lift, but he did not stop, and he did not let Ragna see the pain if he could help it. The stove sat inside the shell like a heart inside a chest. The firebox door faced outward through the access mouth. The chimney pipe rose from the stovetop, through the collar Aslak had fabricated, and out through a new hole in the cabin roof that Ragna had cut and flashed with tin. The vent pipe, a short length of open pipe welded to the top of the shell, stood beside the chimney collar, open to the room air. The fill hatch was a flat steel plate that sat on the shell's top without a seal, loose enough to lift with 1 hand. They filled it for the first time on the 12th of November. Ragna and Eli carried water from the well in buckets 47 trips and poured it through the fill hatch until the level reached the mark Aslak had scratched on the inside, 2/3 full, leaving headspace for expansion and steam. The water was cold. The shell was cold. The cabin was cold. Ragna lit the fire. For the first hour, nothing seemed to happen. The stove burned. The chimney drew. Smoke went up and out. The air near the access mouth was warm the way it always was, a small circle of heat around a small iron box. And the rest of the cabin was indifferent. Marte's words came back. You're spending wood to warm water when you don't even have enough wood to warm yourself. Then, in the second hour, the shell began to change. Ragna put her hand on the steel 2 feet from the access mouth and felt warmth, not the sharp heat of the stove. A deeper warmth, slower, rising from inside the steel itself as the water behind it absorbed and conducted. By the third hour, the entire lower half of the shell was warm to the touch, and the upper half was getting there, and the air in the cabin had shifted from the usual hot near cold far pattern to something more even, more distributed, as if the room had a second source of heat that did not come from one point but from a surface. She let the fire burn for 4 hours at half draft, the way Aslak had taught her. Then she banked the coals and closed the damper to a quarter. They went to bed, Eli on the cot near the wall, Ragna on the floor pallet near the shell, close enough to reach the access mouth if something went wrong. She woke at 3 a.m. The fire was nearly out. The coals glowed, but did not flame. The cabin should have been freezing. She had lived through enough cold nights to know exactly what 3 a.m. felt like when the stove died. The air sharp enough to hurt the inside of her nose, the blanket edges stiff, the water bucket skinned with ice. The air was cool, not warm, but not the killing cold she expected. She put her hand on the shell. It was still warm, not hot, warm. The water inside was still giving back what the fire had put in. She checked the vent pipe. A thin curl of steam rose from it into the dark air. The system was breathing. She checked the wash basin on the table. No ice skin. The water moved when she tipped the basin. It was not a triumph. It was a first test on a mild November night, and the temperature outside was perhaps 10 degrees above zero. Cold, but not the killing cold that would come. But the principle was working. The fire had died 3 hours ago, and the room was still livable. In a normal cabin with a normal stove, the room would have been ice by now. Ragna sat on the floor in the dark with her back against the tank and felt the warmth coming through the steel into her spine, and she allowed herself to believe for the first time that the thing might work. It almost stopped working 2 days later. She fired the stove hard on a windy morning, wanting to see how the shell performed under higher heat. She pushed the damper to 3/4 and fed the fire-dry cottonwood splits instead of the green stuff. The chimney roared. The shell heated fast, too fast. The vent pipe hissed louder than she had heard before, and when she put her hand near the fill hatch, a jet of steam stung her wrist and raised a welt. She pulled back. The water inside was close to boiling. The shell was too hot to touch anywhere above the waterline, and on the far side of the shell, the side nearest the north wall, the steel was discolored, the heat spreading unevenly because the water level had dropped on that side, and the exposed steel was taking the fire's radiation directly without water to absorb it. She raked the fire out onto the stone pad the way Aslak had told her. She opened the fill hatch. Steam billowed into the cabin like a laundry gone wrong. Eli coughed from the cot. Ragna waited. It took 20 minutes for the shell to cool enough to touch. The water level had dropped 4 inches from evaporation. The seam on the upper left side, a seam she had tested and chalked and peened herself, was spitting. A thin line of water darkened the steel and dripped onto the floor. She walked to Aslak's smithy that afternoon. She did not cry. She had not cried since the funeral, but her voice was steady the way a voice is steady when the person behind it is holding everything in place by force. "The seam leaked," she said. "Which one?" "Upper left, the one I peened in October." Aslak nodded. "At what heat?" "Too high. I overfired. The seam moved because the steel expanded faster than the rivets could follow. You ran it too hot on one side because the water level dropped." He looked at her. "What did you do?" "Pulled the fire, opened the hatch, waited." "Good. Then you are alive and the lesson cost you a welt and a puddle." He stood from the bench. "Come, we will repeen that seam, and I will show you how to read the water line by the sound the shell makes when you tap it. You should never have to guess the level. The steel will tell you." They walked back to the cabin together, Aslak's bad hip swinging him sideways on every third step, and he repeened the seam while Ragna held the interior form and Eli boiled coffee on the stovetop through the access mouth because the stove still worked fine even after the shell misbehaved. It was a strange image, a man hammering rivets on a boiler while a girl made coffee inside it, and Ragna thought that if Torsten could see this, he would add it to his inventory of reasons she was going to fail. The chimney backed smoke on a crosswind 3 days after that. Ragna had to climb onto the roof in the dark and clear a bird's nest, or what she thought was a bird's nest, though it turned out to be a clump of dried grass the wind had shoved into the pipe cap. She came down with soot on her face and a scrape on her forearm from the tin edge, and Eli told her she looked like a chimney sweep from a picture book they had left in Norway. There were other problems. The first firing heated one side of the cabin noticeably warmer than the other because the shell radiated mostly from its exposed surface, and the wall side reflected heat back into the steel instead of into the room. Ragna solved this by packing clay and straw behind the shell to insulate the wall side and force more heat outward. The floor nearest the stone pad stayed cold because the stone absorbed heat downward. She laid scrap boards over the stone for foot insulation. The fill hatch rattled in the wind when the door opened. She weighted it with a flat rock. Each fix was small. Each fix took time she did not have. Each fix meant another day closer to the cold, with the system still imperfect. Petermone came back on the last day of November. He stood in the doorway and looked at the boiler shell sitting on its stone pad, with the stovepipe rising through the collar and the vent pipe steaming gently, and the fill hatch weighted with a rock and the split tin can nailed to the wall above it. He looked at it for a long time. "That's a traction boiler shell," he said. "It is." "With your stove inside it?" "Yes." "And water around it?" "Yes." Peter walked closer. He put his hand on the shell the way he had put his hand on the north wall in September, testing, feeling. The shell was warm. The room was warmer than he expected. He could tell because he had not yet unbuttoned his coat, and he was starting to sweat. "It's holding heat," he said. Not a question. "Since last night. I fired at 6. It's noon now. The fire has been out for 3 hours. Peter stepped back. He looked at the vent pipe. He looked at the chimney collar. He looked at the stone pad and the clay packing and the overflow bucket on the floor. "In a real cold snap," Peter said. "This room is going to lose heat through every chink in that wall faster than your water can give it back. It works now because it's 30 above outside. When it's 30 below, the math changes. The cold comes in faster than the warm goes out, and that tank becomes dead iron by morning." "Maybe," Ragna said. "Not maybe. I've seen it. Good ideas die in January." "Then I'll find out in January." Peter looked at her. He did not argue. He buttoned his coat and left. At the door, he stopped and said, without turning around, "If it does fail, don't wait. Bring the girl to town. My wife will take you in." It was the kindest thing he had said to her. It was also the most certain expression of doubt she had received, because kindness that prepares for failure is kindness that expects it. December arrived cold and stayed cold, and the system held. Not perfectly, not without maintenance. Ragna fired twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, and let the tank carry the heat between sessions. The wood consumption was less than what the bare stove had required for the same hours of warmth, because the tank released heat gradually instead of the stove wasting it in bursts. She measured it the only way she could, by counting splits used per day and comparing it to what she had burned in October before the shell was installed. The count was lower, not half, but lower enough to stretch her remaining wood further into the winter than anyone had told her it would go. The cabin was not warm the way a well-built house with a proper furnace was warm. It was livable. The air near the shell stayed comfortable, the far corners still chilled by morning. The floor was cold everywhere except near the stone pad. Frost still formed on the inside of the window glass, but the wash basin water did not freeze overnight anymore. Eli could sleep through the night without waking from cold. The milk cow's water bucket in the lean-to, which shared a wall with the shell, stayed liquid 2 hours longer than it had before. These were small victories. Ragna collected them the way she collected everything, carefully, without celebration, knowing they would be tested. The stories from the wider plains that December were not small. Trains stalled in drifts west of the river. A supply wagon froze in on the road to Huron, and the driver lost 3 fingers before help arrived. Families burned hay and corn cobs when their wood ran out. A woman in a dugout 40 miles north held her children against a shared body heat through a 3-day blow and came out alive, but could not straighten her arms for a week from the cold that had settled in her joints. Winter on the Dakota Plains was not an event. It was a siege, and the siege tested everything: walls, fuel, food, will, and the machinery people built to keep the cold on the other side. Marte came over on Christmas Day with a jar of preserved plums and stayed long enough to feel the shell. "It's warm," she said, surprised despite herself. "It's been warm since November." Marte stood close to the shell with her hands out, the way people stand near a stove. But the heat from the shell was different, less sharp, more diffuse, more like standing near a sun-warmed wall in summer than standing near a fire. "What happens when it gets truly cold?" Marte asked. "I fire heavier and longer. The water stores more. The shell gives it back slower. And if the wood runs out before the cold breaks, then I burn less and the tank carries more of the gap. That's the whole point. The tank buys time the stove can't." Marte touched the vent pipe. Steam curled around her fingers. "Torsten is telling people you'll be dead by February. Torsten is telling people whatever sells coal." Marte left the plums and went home. She did not say the system would work. She did not say it would fail. She said, "I hope January is kind." On the plains, that was as close to prayer as practical women came. January was not kind. The 12th of January, 1888, began as a lie. The morning was mild, absurdly, dangerously mild. The temperature had climbed overnight to something near 40 degrees, warm enough that meltwater dripped from the eaves, and the snow on the south side of the cabin softened to slush. Ragna opened the door and felt air that belonged to March, not January, and for a moment the whole desperate architecture of the winter, the shell, the water, the seams, the vent pipe, the damper positions memorized in the dark, seemed like an elaborate solution to a problem that had decided not to arrive. Eli wanted to go outside without her coat. Ragna let her. Children across the territory were doing the same thing. Teachers were holding outdoor lessons. Farmers were making trips they had postponed for weeks. The mild air was a gift, and people took it the way frontier people took all gifts, immediately, fully, without asking what it would cost. The cost arrived in the afternoon. Ragna saw it before she felt it. The northwest horizon went black. Not gray, not overcast, black, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the entire edge of the sky. The blackness moved. It moved fast. And ahead of it, the wind shifted from south to north in a single gust that slammed the cabin door shut hard enough to knock the tin cup off the table. The temperature fell like something dropped from a height. Within an hour, the warm air was gone. Within 2 hours, the cold was worse than anything December had produced. Within 4 hours, the world outside the cabin had disappeared into a horizontal wall of snow, driven by wind that screamed through every gap in the boards and shook the roof timbers hard enough to rattle the chimney collar. Ragna had felt cold before. She had lived through Norwegian winters and Dakota autumns and the creeping nightly chill of a cabin that bled heat through its walls. This was different. This was violent. The cold did not seep in, it broke in, as if the cabin walls were suggestions rather than barriers. Frost formed on the inside of the north wall in minutes. The water bucket near the door skinned with ice while she watched. The air in the cabin dropped from comfortable to painful in the time it took to cross the room. She fired the stove. She fired it hard, full damper, dry splits, the best wood she had left. The fire roared inside the shell, and the chimney drew, and the flames lit the access, mouth orange and gold. She could feel the stove heating the water, could hear the faint tick of the steel expanding, could see the first wisps of steam rising from the vent pipe. But the cabin was losing heat through the walls, faster than she had ever measured, faster than December had demanded. And the shell was starting from a lower base because she had let the morning fire die down in the false warmth of the thaw. Eli was coughing, not the dry cough of cold air, a wet cough deep in the chest that had started 2 days before and that Ragna had treated with hot water and honey and willful refusal to call it what it was becoming. Now, with the temperature falling through the floor and the wind finding every chink in the wall, Eli lay on the cot under every blanket they owned and shook with a fever that turned her cheeks red and her hands white. Ragna packed the north wall chinks with rags and flour paste. She hung the spare quilt over the window. She dragged the cot closer to the shell, as close as she could get it without risk of the girl touching the hot steel. She boiled water in a pot on the stovetop through the access mouth and made Eli drink it in sips. The thermometer on the door frame, which Ragna had nailed there in October because Aslak told her to always know the number, read 6 above 0 at 4 in the afternoon. At 6 in the evening, it read 9 below. By 8, it had stopped falling only because the mercury column had retreated to the bottom of its range. The wind did not stop. The snow did not stop. The cold did not negotiate. At 9 in the evening, a man appeared at the door. Not appeared, staggered. Ragna heard the pounding over the wind and opened the door to find Jens, Torsten Vic's hired hand, on his knees in the snow with ice in his beard, and his right hand bare because he had lost the glove somewhere between town and the claim. He was shaking so hard he could not speak in complete sentences. The words came in fragments. Store stove failed, flue iced. Torsten sent him for help, got lost in the white, saw the smoke from her chimney. Could he come in? Please, could he come in? Ragna pulled him through the door. She sat him near the shell. She put his bare hand in warm water from the tank, not hot, warm, because Aslak had told her once that rewarming frozen flesh too fast could destroy it. She wrapped him in the horse blanket that smelled like the pony. She gave him the hot water Eli would not finish. 3 people in the cabin now, 1 with a fever, one half frozen, one trying to calculate whether the wood she had left would last the night if she was heating 3 bodies instead of 2. She looked at the wood pile by the door. She had 12 splits of dry cottonwood, 8 splits of green, and a handful of bark scraps. That was less than she had planned for because December had been colder than expected, and she had fired heavier than her schedule to keep Eli comfortable during the cough, and the wood she had cut from the dismantled lean-to extension had burned faster than solid cordwood. 12 dry splits, 8 green, one night, 3 people, a blizzard that showed no sign of stopping. She fed the stove 4 dry splits and set the damper to 3/4. The fire climbed. The shell heated. The vent pipe hissed. She could feel the water absorbing the heat, could feel the steel warming under her palm, and she knew in the part of her mind that counted everything, always, whether she wanted to or not, that the fire at this rate would consume the dry wood by midnight. After midnight, she would have the green splits, which burned cooler and slower and produced more smoke. After the green splits, she would have bark and nothing. The system had to work, not the stove. The stove would die. The system, the water, the mass, the stored heat in 2,000 pounds of warm steel and warm water had to carry the room from midnight to dawn on what the fire put in before it went out. If you're with Ragna right now, if you need to know whether this holds, hit subscribe, because what happens in this cabin over the next 8 hours is the reason this story exists. She throttled the damper, not because she wanted to, because Aslak's voice was in her head, saying the words he had said on the day he taught her draft control, a fire that lasts 4 hours at half draw instead of 2 hours at full. She pulled the damper from 3/4 to just past half. The fire dropped. The roar became a murmur. The orange glow in the access mouth dimmed to red. She was banking heat into the water instead of wasting it into the air. She was trusting the mass. She was trusting the physics. She was trusting a dead man's kettle lesson and a lame blacksmith's teaching and her own arithmetic against the worst night the prairie had produced in a decade. Jens asked her what the shell was. "A heater," she said. "It's a boiler." "It's a heater. The stove heats the water. The water heats the room. The room stays warm after the fire dies." Jens looked at the shell. He looked at the vent pipe. He looked at the split tin can nailed to the wall. He did not understand any of it. He put his rewrapped hand against the steel and felt the warmth and said nothing more. At midnight, the dry wood was gone. Ragna fed the last 4 green splits into the firebox and closed the damper to 1/4. The fire was low now, not flames, but a deep bed of coals that glowed orange through the draft slot. The smoke from the green wood was thick and sour, and some of it leaked through the collar joint and hung in the cabin air. Eli coughed. Jens coughed. Ragna opened the fill hatch an inch wider to let the steam vent pull some of the smoke upward. She checked the shell. The water temperature was high, too hot to hold her hand against the steel for more than a few seconds. Good. The mass was charged. The fire had done its work. Now the question was how long the work would last. 1 in the morning. The fire was coals and char. The cabin air was warm. The north wall was frosted white, but the frost stopped in a line 4 feet from the shell, where the radiated heat held it back. The floor near the stone pad was warm enough that Ragna had taken off her boots. 2 in the morning, the coals were gray. No flame. The chimney had stopped drawing. The shell was still warm, not hot now, but warm, a steady even warmth that came from the mass of water releasing what it had stored. The cabin temperature had dropped, but it had dropped slowly, the way a lake cools after sunset instead of the way a puddle freezes on a stone. 3 in the morning. Ragna put her hand on the shell and felt warmth. less than an hour ago, but present. The vent pipe still breathed a thin curl of steam. The water inside was still above the air temperature, still radiating, still giving. Eli was asleep. Her forehead was hot with fever, but her breathing was steady. The blankets around her were warm at the edges where they touched the radiated air from the shell. In a cabin without the tank, on a night like this, with the fire dead for 3 hours, those blankets would have been cold enough to feel like damp cloth against the skin. Jens was asleep on the floor, wrapped in the horse blanket, close enough to the shell that Ragna could hear his breathing over the wind. 4 in the morning. The shell was cooling. Ragna could feel the difference now, the warmth retreating inward, the steel surface dropping toward room temperature, the radiation weakening. The cabin air was no longer warm, it was cool, but cool was not cold, and cold was not killing, and killing was what the world outside the door was doing to anything without shelter. She fed the bark scraps into the firebox. They caught from the remaining coals and burned bright and fast, and gave maybe 20 minutes of new heat into the water. Not much. Enough to push the curve a little further, 5 in the morning. The wind was still screaming. The thermometer was still useless at the bottom of its range. Frost had crept closer to the shell, reclaiming territory the heat had held. The air in the cabin was cold enough now that Ragna could see her breath again. But Eli's blankets were still warm at the edges. The wash basin water was still liquid. Jens was still breathing without shaking. She sat on the floor with her back against the shell and felt the last of the warmth coming through the steel into her body. It was not enough to be comfortable. It was enough to be alive. The tank had carried them 5 hours past the death of the fire. 5 hours in which a bare stove cabin would have dropped to lethal cold. 5 hours in which the water remembered what the wood had given it and spent it slowly, degree by degree, into the room and the blankets and the bodies that needed it. She did not sleep. She sat against the tank and listened to the wind and waited for dawn the way people wait for verdicts. Dawn came gray and howling. The storm was not over, but the darkness lifted enough to see the frost on the walls and the steam still, curling from the vent pipe. The water was barely warm now. The shell was cool to the touch in most places, but it was not frozen. The room was not frozen. The girl was not frozen. The man was not frozen. She looked at the woodpile, empty. She looked at the firebox, ash and char. She looked at the thermometer, still pinned at the bottom. And then Peter Moen walked through the door. Not walked, fell through. He had been on the road with a team when the storm hit, and he had fought the wind for 6 hours before he saw smoke. Her smoke, the thin line from the chimney that should have stopped producing smoke hours ago, but hadn't quite, because the bark scraps and the last green splits had given enough to keep a trickle going. He had followed the smoke to the cabin, and he had beaten on the door, and Ragna had opened it, and he had come in expecting to find what he always found when he entered a cabin after a blow like this: silence and cold, and the particular stillness of a room that had given up. He found warmth. Not much, but warmth. He found a girl asleep with a fever, and a hired hand asleep on the floor, and a woman sitting against a steel tank that was still giving heat into a room that had no fire and no wood and no right to be above freezing. Peter stood in the doorway with snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard, and looked at the tank and looked at Ragna and did not say a word for a long time. The cabin was alive. The fire was dead, and the wood was gone, and the blizzard was still trying to kill everything on the open plains. And the cabin was alive because 2,000 pounds of water had absorbed 4 hours of fire and spent it across 8 hours of dark. And that arithmetic, that simple, patient arithmetic of mass and time and heat, had done what 6 cords of wood in an open stove could not. Not blazing heat, not comfort. Enough. The storm blew for 2 more days. Peter stayed. Jens stayed. Neighbors who could reach the cabin brought what wood they could spare, and Ragna fired the system again and again. Shorter burns now, careful burns, letting the mass do the work the fuel could not. On the next claim east, a family without enough fuel burned their table and their bed frame and their youngest daughter's cradle to keep the stove going, and they still woke with ice on the blankets. South of town, a stock barn lost every animal inside when the temperature held below 25 under zero for 30 consecutive hours. A traveler on the road between De Smet and Huron was found in a drift 4 days after the storm broke, frozen in the position of a man trying to stand. Ragna's cabin held, the shell held, the water held, the seams held. It was not a miracle. It was a tank full of warm water in a room full of cold air, doing exactly what the physics said it would do for exactly as long as the math allowed. But on the plains in January of 1888, math that worked felt like something closer to grace. The storm broke on the 14th. The wind dropped first, then the snow thinned, then the sky cracked open along the southern horizon and let through a light so white it hurt to look at. The temperature stayed brutal, well below zero through the 15th, but the air was still, and still air on the plains after a blow felt like mercy, even when it was cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Peter did not leave immediately. He stayed through the morning of the 15th, helping Ragna dig the door clear and check the lean-to where the pony and the cow had survived on body heat and the shared wall warmth from the shell. The cow's water bucket had frozen, but only overnight after the last fire died completely. In most barns on the plains, the water froze within hours of the storm's arrival. Peter noted this without comment. Jens left first, walking toward town with his rewrapped hand held against his chest and his head down against the residual cold. He said thank you once, at the door, and then he said something else. He said, "The store stove went out in the first 4 hours. Torsten burned the display shelving to keep the back room warm. He ran out of shelving before midnight." Ragna filed that information without responding. Torsten's stove had failed in 4 hours. Her fire had died at midnight, and the tank had carried the room for 5 hours beyond that. The comparison was not lost on Jens. It would not be lost on Torsten. After Jens left, Petter stood by the shell and put both hands flat on the steel. It was cold now. The water inside had finally equalized with the room temperature, and the room had dropped to freezing in the hours since the last bark scraps burned out. But the shell was intact. The seams were dry. The vent pipe was clear. The system had performed exactly as designed, under conditions that had killed livestock and stranded travelers and driven families to burn their furniture. "I told you the thing would kill you," Peter said. He was not looking at Ragna. He was looking at the shell. "I told you that when the real cold came, your trick would fail, and you and the girl would freeze. I said it to your face, and I meant it. And I was wrong." Ragna said nothing. "The cold did what it always does," Peter said. "It came through the walls, and it took the air, and it killed the fire. And you kept a room alive anyway, not with more wood, not with coal, with water." He took his hands off the shell. "I do not understand how it works, but I stood in this room at dawn with no fire burning, and the air was warm enough to breathe without pain, and that is something I have never seen in 12 winters on this ground." He looked at her then. "You should show people." "I will. I mean soon, before the next blow. There are families out there who burned everything they had and still woke cold. They need to know this exists." "I know." Peter left that afternoon. He drove his team back toward town through drifts that reached the wagon bed, and Ragna watched him go and thought about the word he had used. Show, not tell. not explain. Show. Because telling people that water held heat was a lecture, and lectures did not survive the walk home. Showing people a warm room with a dead fire was proof, and proof traveled on its own legs. Marte Nesheim came 3 days after the storm broke. She did not come to visit, she came to learn. Ragna could see it in the way she walked through the door, not the casual sideways step of a neighbor stopping by, but the direct, forward-leaning stride of someone who had made a decision and wanted the information before the decision could unmake itself. "How bad was it at your place?" Ragna asked. "Bad enough. We burned the hay reserve and 2 fence rails. The stove ran all night both nights, and the cabin still dropped below freezing by 3 in the morning. My husband slept in his coat and boots. The children slept between us." Marte paused. "How bad was it here?" "I had 3 people in the cabin, a fever, and the wood ran out at midnight." And the tank carried us to dawn." Marte walked to the shell. She put her hand on it the way everyone did, testing, doubting, waiting for the steel to confirm or deny what she had heard. The shell was warm. Ragna had fired that morning, normal burn, half draft, 3 hours. The fire was out. The room was comfortable. "Show me how it works," Marte said. Ragna showed her, not the theory, the practice. She showed her the damper positions. She showed her the waterline tap test where you struck the shell with a knuckle and listened for the change in pitch that told you where the water level sat. She showed her the vent pipe and explained what it meant when steam came out steady versus when it surged. She showed her the split tin can on the wall. "What's that?" Marte asked. "A reminder. Aslak showed me what happens when you seal heated water in a closed vessel. It explodes. That can is what's left." "So the tank must never be sealed?" "Never. The fill hatch sits loose. The vent stays open. The overflow bucket catches any surge. If you close those 3 things, you have a bomb, not a heater." Marte absorbed this. She walked around the shell, touching the seams, looking at the collar, examining the stone pad and the clay insulation and the scrapboard floor covering. She was cataloging. She was measuring. She was thinking about her own cabin, her own stove, her own winters, and whether any version of this could fit into a life that had almost ended 3 days ago. "Could I build one?" she asked. "Not from a boiler shell. Those aren't common enough. But the principle works with anything that holds water and takes heat. A steel trough, a set of barrels, even a stone wall with water channels if you could build one." Ragna paused. "The point is not the shape. The point is the mass. Water holds heat. Steel conducts it. The room gets the benefit after the fire dies. You don't need my shell. You need the idea." Marte stayed for 2 hours. She asked questions that Ragna answered and questions that Ragna could not answer, and the questions she could not answer she wrote down on a scrap of paper so she could ask Aslak. Before she left, Marte set a cloth bundle on the table. Inside was a ball of old wool and a jar of flour paste. "For the chinks," Marte said. "I brought it during the build and never told you what it was for. It's for insulating. Pack the wool into the gaps and seal it with the paste. It won't stop the cold entirely, but it will slow it down, and slower cold means your tank has more time to work." Ragna looked at the bundle. She looked at Marte. "You brought this during the build, before you believed it would work." "I brought it because Eli was shivering, and a child does not need to believe in a theory to deserve warm walls." That was the moment Ragna understood that Marte's skepticism had never been hostility. It had been fear, the specific, practical fear of a woman who had watched clever plans fail and did not want to see a child pay for someone else's gamble. The skepticism was protection. The wool was protection. They were the same instinct pointed in different directions. The neighbors came in 1s and 2s over the next 3 weeks. a man named Herbrand from 2 claims north, who had lost a calf in the storm and nearly lost his wife to exposure when their cabin stove cracked from overfiring. He stood in Ragna's cabin and looked at the shell and asked how much it would cost to build one. Ragna told him the truth. The shell had cost her nothing because it was scrap. The stone was free from the creek bed. The collar was $1.50, and the rest was labor. His face changed. He had expected the answer to be money. The answer was work. A widow named Birgit from south of the crossroads, who had 3 children and a cabin smaller than Ragna's, and a stove that consumed wood the way a sickness consumed strength, constantly, insatiably, without ever seeming satisfied. She asked whether a smaller version could work. Ragna said yes, if the water mass was proportional to the room size and the firing schedule was adjusted. Birgit asked if Ragna would come and look at her place. Ragna said she would. A freighter who had heard about the tank from Pater and wanted to know if the principal could keep a way station warm between supply runs. Ragna told him the principal would work anywhere heat needed to outlast fuel, but that the safety rules were not negotiable. She told him about the vent. She told him about the fill hatch. She showed him the split tin can. Each visitor asked the same question in different words. How does it work? And each time Ragna found that the explanation was not the hard part. The hard part was convincing people that the explanation was the whole truth. They expected a secret. They expected a trick. They expected the thing that made it work to be something hidden, something expensive, something beyond their reach. The thing that made it work was water. Water and steel and fire and time, arranged in the right order, managed with the right discipline. The secret was that there was no secret. The secret was arithmetic. Torsten Vik heard about the visitors the way he heard about everything, through the general flow of commerce and gossip that passed through his store like water through a sieve. He heard that Peter Moen was telling people the tank had worked. He heard that Marte Neschheim was planning to adapt the idea for her own cabin. He heard that a widow from south of the crossroads was asking Ragna to consult on her stove arrangement. He heard all of this, and he said in the store, within earshot of 4 customers, "I've always supported careful experimentation. If the TV woman's idea has merit, it should be shared properly. I can supply the fittings, pipe collars, vent caps, damper plates at fair terms." The price he quoted for a pipe collar was 3 times what Aslak had charged Ragna, and the fair terms included a lien against improvements. Ragna heard about the pricing from Herbrand, who had gone to Torsten first because the store was closer than the smithy. She said nothing about Torsten. She showed Herbrand how to fabricate a collar from scrap tin using a pattern she had cut from the original, and she told him Aslak could refine the fit for $1 if the tin work was rough. The collar did not need to be perfect. It needed to be functional and safe. Torsten's margins shrank by 1 collar, then by 2, then by 5 as word spread that the fittings could be made from scrap and the knowledge could be had for free from the woman on the T8 claim. Aslak did not celebrate the validation. He came to the cabin the week after the storm, inspected every seam, checked the chimney collar for heat warping, measured the stone pad for settling, and then sat at the table and told Ragna to teach him back everything he had taught her. "Why?" she asked. "Because if you cannot explain it to me in your own words, you do not own it yet. You are borrowing my knowledge. When I am gone, borrowed knowledge goes with me. You're not going anywhere. I am 58 years old with a hip that locks in the cold and a chest that does not like mornings. I am going somewhere, and you know where." He tapped the table. "Teach me. Start with seam testing." She taught him. She described the tap, the chalk, the cold water fill, the watch for weep stains. She described the peening technique, which hammer weight, which angle, how many strikes, how to feel the rivet seat under the hammer face. She described draft control in her own words, not his, and when she used a phrase he had not used, he asked her where she got it, and she said she had figured it out from practice. He nodded. "Now pressure," he said. She pointed to the split tin can. "Never seal heated water, never block the vent, never cap the overflow. If the vent goes quiet while the fire is burning, pull the fire immediately. Rake the coals onto the stone, open every hatch, wait." Why? Because water expands when heated. Steam builds pressure. A sealed vessel at temperature has nowhere to send the pressure except through the weakest point. The weakest point fails. The failure is violent. Good. Aslak stood. "You own it now." Over the following weeks, they worked together on what Aslak called the second build. Not a new shell, but a set of improvements to the existing one that would make it safer and more efficient for the next winter. Stone footings instead of the field stone pad, mortared properly. A wider heat shield behind the shell to protect the wall. Measured fill lines scratched into the interior so the water line was never guessed. A removable inspection cap on the lower seam so she could check for corrosion without draining the whole system. Better clay packing. A draft gauge made from a strip of tin hung inside the chimney collar that vibrated differently at different draw speeds. They disagreed about the heat shield. Aslak wanted it built from stone. Ragna wanted sheet steel because it was lighter and easier to replace. They argued about it for 2 days, not shouting, not hostile, but the firm, specific disagreement of two people who both understood the problem and had different ideas about the solution. Aslak said stone absorbed heat and radiated it, adding mass to the system. Ragna said the wall behind the shell did not need to radiate. It needed to reflect heat back into the room, and steel reflected better than stone. Aslak said steel warped. Ragna said she would replace warped steel. Aslak said she would not always have scrap steel to replace it with. Ragna said she would not always have a blacksmith to cut stone for her either. They compromised. Stone on the lower half, where the heat was greatest and warping was most likely. Sheet steel on the upper half, angled slightly outward to bounce radiant heat into the room. It was an ugly solution. It worked better than either pure approach would have. Aslak told her during the heat shield work about the river. He had worked on steamboats for 6 years before his hip broke. He had seen a boiler fail on a packet boat near Dubuque, not his boat, a boat tied at the next pier, and the explosion killed 3 men and opened the hull like a tin can split on a forge. He had nightmares about it for years. That was why he cared about the vent pipe. That was why he had made her hold the split can and look at it. That was why, when she talked about sealing the fill hatch tighter to hold more heat, his voice went flat and hard, and the teaching turned into something closer to a command. "I watched a man burn alive because someone closed a valve that should have stayed open," Aslak said. "That is not a lesson I repeat. That is a line I hold." Ragna did not argue with that line. She nailed the split can back to the wall after every cleaning and made sure it was the first thing anyone saw when they looked at the fill hatch. Aslak Brecka died on the 9th of April, 1888. His hip had locked in the cold of February and never fully released. He worked through March with a limp that worsened and a cough that deepened and a stubbornness that prevented him from admitting either one was winning. He finished the inspection cap on the 2nd of April. He sharpened his peening hammer on the 4th. He came to Ragna's cabin on the 7th to inspect the spring drainage. The system had to be drained and dried before warm weather to prevent rust and algae. And he sat at the table afterward and drank coffee and told her the hammer was hers now. "I don't need your hammer," she said. "I need you to be here in November when I refill the system." "You don't need me in November. You know everything I know about steel at heat. The rest is practice." He set the coffee cup down. "The hammer is not sentiment. It is a tool. A good peening hammer is worth more than most of what's in that store of Torsten's, and it will last longer. Take it." She took it. He left. He did not come back. He died in his sleep, in the room behind the smithy, with the forge cold and his boots still on. The doctor in town said his heart. The woman who found him said he looked like a man who had finished something and put himself away. Ragna did not go to the funeral. She could not explain why, except that funerals were for people who needed to say goodbye in public, and she had said goodbye at the table when she took the hammer. She hung it on the wall beside the split tin can, the two things Aslak had given her, one a warning and one a tool, and together they were everything he had taught her compressed into iron and tin. The cabin was quiet that night. Eli was asleep. The stove was cold because April did not need firing. The shell sat on its stone pad, drained and dry, waiting for November. Ragna sat beside it in the dark and put her hand on the steel the way she had on the first night it worked. And the steel was cold because there was no water in it, and no fire under it, and no warmth left to give. She held her hand there anyway. She held it there for a long time. The prairie was greening outside. The snow was gone. The worst winter in a decade was over, and she was alive, and Eli was alive, and the man who had made that possible was not. The secondary crisis came in December of 1888, 11 months after the blizzard. It was not weather this time. It was sickness. A pneumonia outbreak spread through the scattered claims east of town, carried by a freighter who had coughed his way through three-way stations before anyone understood what he was carrying. Within 2 weeks, 4 families had sick members. Within 3, a child on the Herbrand claim was fighting for breath and losing. Pneumonia in a plains cabin was not just a medical problem, it was a heating problem. A sick person needed stable warmth, not the flash and fade cycle of a stove that ran hot and then ran cold, but the sustained, even heat that let a fever break without the body spending its last energy fighting the cold between firings. Doctors in town said so. Common sense said so. And the families that had conventional stoves said what they had always said. We cannot keep the cabin warm all night because the fire dies, and the wood runs out, and the cold comes back. Ragna heard about the Herbrand child from Marte, who rode over on a morning when the temperature was 10 below and falling. The boy is bad, Marte said. His chest sounds like a bellows with a hole in it. Herbrand's wife has been up 3 nights running the stove, but the cabin drops to freezing every time she falls asleep. The boy's fever spikes when the room goes cold. The doctor says stable warmth could make the difference. Has Herbrand built his tank yet? He started. He has the trough and the stone. He doesn't have the collar or the vent, and he doesn't know how to test the seams. He was going to come to you in January. January was 5 weeks away. The boy did not have 5 weeks. Ragna left Eli with Marte and rode the pony to the Herbrand claim with Aslak's hammer in her saddlebag and a rolled-up paper pattern for the chimney collar in her coat. The Herbrand cabin was smaller than hers and colder. The stove was a number 5 box, even smaller than her number 6, and it sat in the corner on bare floorboards with a stack of cottonwood that Herbrand had been burning at a rate that would exhaust it by mid-January. The boy lay on a cot near the stove, wrapped in quilts, breathing in a shallow rasp that filled the cabin with a sound like tearing cloth. Herbrand had a steel stock trough he had bought to use as the tank. It was smaller than Ragna's boiler shell, 5 feet long and 2 feet deep, but it was steel. It was intact, and it could hold water. It's not big enough for a full system, Ragna said, but it's big enough to extend the heat through the night. The water mass will be less, so the overnight carry will be shorter. 4 hours instead of 5 or 6, but 4 hours is 4 hours your wife is not waking to feed the stove, and 4 hours of stable warmth around that cot could matter. They built it in 2 days. Ragna showed Herbrand how to tap the trough seams for weaknesses. She showed his wife how to set the damper for a slow burn. She fabricated the collar from Herbrand's scrap tin using the paper pattern, and she fitted the vent pipe from a length of stovepipe Herbrand had in the barn. She laid field stone under the trough, packed clay behind it, and filled it to the 2/3 mark. The first firing heated the trough to working temperature in 2 hours. The trough was smaller, the water less, but the principle held. The cabin air stabilized. The stove side temperature variation, the wild swing from hot to cold that had tortured the sick boy every time the fire died, flattened. The boy's cot sat in a zone of steady warmth that the trough maintained for 4 hours after the fire went to coals. Herbrand's wife slept for the first time in 4 nights. She slept 4 hours. The boy's fever broke on the second night of the trough system, and although Ragna could not say the warmth caused the break, fevers broke for their own reasons, on their own schedules. She could say that the boy's body had not had to fight the cold while it fought the sickness, and that was one less battle on a body that could not afford another. If this story reminds you that preparation is not just about yourself, that what you build might save someone else's child, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Rosanna stayed 3 days. She taught Herbrand the maintenance. She made him repeat the pressure safety rules. She made him look at the vent pipe and promise that it would never be capped or blocked or covered with a rag to keep the heat in. She told him about the split tin can on her wall and what it meant, and when she left, Herbrand nailed a bent horseshoe nail above his fill hatch as his own reminder that sealed water kills. She rode home in the dark on the coldest night of December, and she realized on the way that she had done something Aslak had done for her. She had seen competence in someone else and responded to it with teaching instead of charity. Herbrand was not stupid. Herbrand was a man with a sick child and a steel trough, and no one to show him how the steel worked at heat. She had shown him. He would show someone else. The knowledge was moving. Torsten heard about the Herbrand installation within a week. He responded the way he always responded to things that threatened his position. He tried to own them. He began telling people in the store that the tank method was promising but dangerous without proper fittings, and that he could supply certified pipe collars, vent caps, and damper plates at prices that reflected the safety engineering involved. He used the word certified as if it meant something on a stretch of prairie where the nearest engineering office was 200 miles away. Ragna did not argue with Torsten publicly. She simply continued teaching people how to make their own fittings from scrap. Every collar she helped fabricate was a collar Torsten did not sell. Every vent pipe cut from salvage was a vent pipe his inventory did not move. The economics were slow but directional, and Torsten could feel the direction the way a man standing in a river feels the current, not as a single force, but as a constant gentle pressure that moves everything it touches. He began calling the system Vic's heat tank in conversation, as if naming it after himself would attach his authority to the idea. 3 families corrected him independently. They called it what the claims had always called it, since the first day the gossip spread, the wet furnace. And they knew whose wet furnace it was. By the end of January 1889, Ragna had helped build or advise on 4 installations within wagon distance of her claim. Each was different vessel, different stove size, different cabin layout, but each used the same principles: vented mass, controlled draft, slow heat release, and the absolute prohibition against sealing heated water. She had taught 4 families the tap test, the damper positions, and the pressure safety rules. She had made 4 people look at the split tin can or its equivalent and promised to remember what it meant. She was 27 years old. She had buried a husband, survived a blizzard, lost a mentor, and saved a child who was not hers. She was not an inventor in any formal sense. She was a woman who had paid attention to a kettle and remembered what her father had said about stone and heat, and the difference between making warmth and keeping it. The hammer hung on the wall. The tin can hung beside it. The shell sat on its stone pad, refilled in November, warm through December, tested again in January, and holding, always holding. Not because it was extraordinary, but because the physics was ordinary and the discipline was consistent, and the woman who ran it understood both. The hostile skeptic's arc was not finished. The mentor was gone, but the teaching remained. The claim was proved up, and the cabin was warm, and the prairie was still trying to kill everything on it, and Ragna Tveit was still there, still counting, still measuring, still putting her hand on the steel to feel what the fire had left behind. By the autumn of 1889, the wet furnace had become a phrase that meant something specific on the claims east of town. It did not mean Ragna's particular shell on Ragna's particular stone pad. It meant the principle: vented thermal mass, controlled draft, slow heat release, applied in whatever form a family could manage with whatever materials they could find. The phrase had separated from the object and attached itself to the idea, and the idea was harder to contain than any single machine. Ragna kept a teaching schedule that autumn, not formal, not announced. She simply let it be known through Marte and Peter and the freighter, who had visited after the blizzard, that she would be at her cabin on Saturday mornings, and anyone who wanted to learn the method could come. The first Saturday, 2 people came, the second, 5, the third, 7, including a woman from a claim so far west that she had ridden since before dawn to arrive by mid-morning. The teaching followed a pattern Ragna had developed from the 4 installations she had already supervised. She started with the split tin can. She held it up and told the story of Aslak's forge, the sealed can, the 3 minutes, the split seam, the spray of hot water across the anvil. She told them about the steamboat on the river and the man who burned alive because someone closed a valve. She told them this first before anything else, because the most dangerous thing about the wet furnace was not building it wrong. It was building it right, and then, on a cold night when the fear was louder than the training, deciding to seal the hatch tighter to hold more heat. After the safety lesson, she taught the tap test. She let each person hold the hammer, Aslak's hammer, and strike the shell and listen for the difference between a seated rivet and a loosening one. She taught damper positions with the stove burning live, adjusting the plate while people watched the fire respond. She showed the waterline reading. She showed the overflow bucket placement. She showed the chimney collar and the vent pipe, and the clay packing and the scrap board floor insulation. Each lesson lasted 2 hours. Each person left with the paper pattern for a collar and a list of safety rules written in Ragna's hand on whatever scrap she had available. Some left with confidence. Some left with more questions than they had arrived with. All of them left knowing one thing they had not known before. The problem was not making heat. The problem was keeping it. The community changed in ways that were visible if you knew where to look. Smoke patterns shifted. On claims where families had built some version of the system, the chimney smoke was thinner and burned for shorter periods, the sign of a controlled banked fire, instead of the constant heavy burn of a stove being pushed to its limit. Wood hauling decreased on those claims. Families that had needed 8 cords now made it through on 5 or 6, because the mass did the work the extra wood had been doing. Women who had spent every night feeding a stove could now bank the fire and sleep on the plains in winter was not a luxury. It was medicine. The men noticed the fuel savings first because fuel was money. The women noticed the stable overnight warmth first because warmth was children sleeping through the night and wash water that did not freeze before dawn, and sick beds that held a steady temperature. Both observations pointed to the same conclusion, but they arrived through different doors, and Ragna learned to teach through whichever door her audience was standing nearest. Not every installation worked perfectly. A man on a claim north of Herbrand's built his version with a cracked horse trough and fired it too hard on the first night, and the crack opened under heat stress and dumped 40 gallons of hot water across his cabin floor. No one was hurt, but the mess was spectacular, and the story traveled faster than the explanation. Torsten repeated it in the store as evidence that the method was dangerous in untrained hands. He did not mention that the man had ignored the seam testing step because he was impatient, or that every installation Ragnar had personally supervised was still functioning without incident. Ragnar rode to the man's claim the next day and helped him find the crack, drain the trough, patch the seam with a riveted steel plate, and refill. She showed him the tap test he had skipped. She showed him the chalk marks he should have made. She did not lecture him about impatience because the 40 gallons of water on his floor had already delivered that lecture more effectively than she ever could. She told him about the split tin can. He listened this time. The day Torsten Vik asked Ragnar Tveit for help was the 23rd of February, 1890. A late-season storm had come through fast and hard, not as severe as the blizzard of '88, but brutal enough. Torsten's store had a large iron stove in the front room and a smaller one in the back where he and his wife and his hired hand slept during winter storms. The large stove consumed coal at a rate that Torsten could afford because he sold coal, but the backroom stove had developed a crack in the firebox during the storm, and the crack had widened overnight until the stove was unusable. The backroom temperature dropped to freezing by midnight. Torsten could have moved everyone to the front room and run the big stove all night. He had done this before. But the big stove's flue had partially iced in the storm, the same problem that had driven Jens to Ragnar's door 2 years earlier, and running it at full draft risked a chimney fire from the creosote buildup that the icing had prevented him from cleaning. He was caught. One stove broken, the other dangerous to run. His store full of coal he could burn, but no safe way to burn it. His wife shivering in the back room. His hired hand, a different man now, not Jens, threatening to walk to the livery and sleep in Peter's hayloft if the back room did not warm up. Torsten sent the hired hand to Ragnar's claim with a message. The message did not say please. It said, "Need heat consultation. Will pay fair rate." Ragnar rode to town that afternoon. She brought Aslak's hammer and the collar pattern and a coil of scrap stovepipe. She found Torsten in the front room of the store, standing beside the big stove with his arms crossed and his face set in the expression of a man who was about to receive help he had spent 2 years publicly dismissing. His wife sat behind the counter wrapped in a blanket. The hired hand was nowhere in sight. "The back stove is cracked," Torsten said. "I heard. The front flue is iced. I can run it low, but not full. I can see that. I have a steel feed bin in the storeroom, 40-gallon capacity. It's watertight." He paused. "I want to know if it would work the way your tank works, temporarily, until I can replace the back stove or clean the flue." Ragnar looked at the feed bin. She looked at the back room. She looked at the cracked stove and the iced flue and the pile of coal that Torsten could not safely burn, and she understood the specific quality of this moment. Torsten Vik, who had offered her predatory credit and called her pride expensive and told people she would be dead by February and tried to sell overpriced fittings and renamed her invention after himself and repeated every failure story while ignoring every success. Torsten Vik was standing in his own store asking her to do for him what she had done for her brand and Birgit and every other family on the claims. He was asking because he had no other option. He was asking because the coal did not care about his inventory or his margins or his opinions. The cold cared about the same arithmetic it always cared about: heat in versus heat out, mass versus air, time versus fuel. She could have refused. She could have quoted him the price he charged others for pipe collars and told him the terms included a lien on the store. She could have said any of the things he had said to her and meant them just as precisely. She did not. "The bin will work," Ragnar said. "It's small, so the carry time will be short. 3 hours, maybe 4. But it will stabilize the back room enough to sleep through the night if you bank the front stove at low draft and use the bin as your mass source." She helped him set it up. She showed his wife the damper positions. She tested the bin seams herself. They were tight, no weep, and she fitted a vent from the scrap stovepipe she had brought. She filled the bin to the 2/3 line and fired the repurposed stove connection she had rigged from the front stove's secondary flue outlet. It was not elegant. It was not a proper installation. It was a temporary system built from store inventory by a woman who understood the principle well enough to improvise, and it worked the way all of her systems worked. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but enough. The back room warmed. Torsten's wife unwrapped the blanket from her shoulders. The hired hand came back from wherever he had gone and stood near the bin with his hands out, feeling the heat come through the steel. Torsten paid Ragna $2. She did not quote him 3 times the fair rate. She did not attach a lien. She charged him what the work was worth and left the rest of the lesson to settle in his mind on its own. He never called it Vic's heat tank again. He did not call it the wet furnace either. He simply stopped talking about it in public, which on the plains was as close to concession as a man like Torsten ever came. The store carried pipe collars and vent fittings the following autumn. The price was fair. Ragna did not comment on this. Marta did. She said in the store within earshot of Torsten, "Fair prices. Imagine that." Torsten said nothing. His wife, behind the counter, allowed herself a smile that Torsten pretended not to see. The carpenter arrived in the spring of 1890. His name was Niels Haugen. He was 31, widowed the previous year from a fever that took his wife in Sioux Falls, and he had come west to the claims because staying in the town where she died was harder than starting over somewhere colder. He was a framer by trade, houses, barns, outbuildings. And he had heard about the Tveit claim from a freighter who told him there was a woman out there building heating systems from scrap steel and teaching half the territory how to survive winter without burning their furniture. He came to a Saturday lesson. He sat in the back and listened and did not ask questions. He came to the next one. He asked one question about thermal bridging through the stone pad to the soil underneath, and the question was good enough that Ragna stopped the lesson and answered it in detail, because the question revealed that he understood heat transfer through materials in a way that most of her students did not. After the lesson, he stayed and helped her restack the firewood she had been meaning to reorganize for a week. He did not ask permission. He saw the pile and started moving it, and Ragna said, "The dry goes on the left," and he said, "I know, I can smell the difference." He came back the following week. He brought a saw and cut the 2 dead cottonwoods behind the lean-to that Ragna had been eyeing since the fall, but could not fell alone because one leaned toward the cabin and needed a notch cut precisely. He cut the notch. The tree fell away from the cabin. He bucked it into rounds and split the rounds into stove lengths and stacked them without being asked where. "You're a carpenter," Ragna said. "I was a carpenter. Now I'm a man with a saw standing next to a woman who needs wood cut." "Why?" "Because I heard what you built. I came to see if the person matched the work. The person matches the work." He was not smooth about it. He was not trying to be. He was a man who understood that competence recognized competence, and that on the plains where everything was stripped to its function, the most honest thing you could offer someone was useful work done well. He came back again and again. The visits became routine, then expected, then necessary, in the way that a tool you use every day becomes necessary, not because you cannot live without it, but because living without it requires effort you no longer want to spend. They married in October of 1890 in the cabin, with Eli as witness and Marte as the second. Peter Moen drove them to the church in town for the legal portion and drove them back, and on the way back he said, without looking at either of them, "I still don't understand how water holds heat better than a fire." "Doesn't hold it better," Ragna said. "It holds it longer." Pater thought about this for the rest of the drive. He was still thinking about it when he dropped them at the claim. Niels did not take over the heating work. He did not try. He built frames and walls and outbuildings, and Ragna built heating systems, and they worked beside each other the way Ragna and Aslak had worked, as partners with different skills and shared purpose. When Niels built a new room onto the cabin the following summer, Ragna designed the heat distribution for it before he set the first stud. When Ragna helped a family 4 claims east install a tank, Niels came along and reinforced their floor joists because the weight of the water would have bowed the boards within a month. They had a daughter in 1892. They named her Sigrid after Ragna's mother. Eli, who was 17 by then, held the baby and told Ragna she looked like their father. Ragna said she hoped the girl had his patience and her own stubbornness, because on the plains you needed both and could not always tell which was which. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work continues. 1893. Ragna and Niels expanded the cabin into a proper workshop household, with a dedicated teaching room where the shell served as both heater and demonstration model. 1895. Eli married a teacher from town and moved to a claim of her own, taking with her a steel trough and a paper collar pattern and the safety rules written in Ragna's hand. 1897. A hard winter tested every installation on the eastern claims, and everyone held, and the ones that struggled did so because the operators had drifted from the discipline, not because the principle had failed. Ragna taught through all of it. Every autumn, the Saturday lessons resumed. The faces changed. New families arrived. Old families moved on. Children grew into adults who remembered the tap of a hammer on a steel shell and the sound of the vent pipe breathing in the dark. The teaching did not change. It always started with the split tin can. Some families adopted the full water tank mass. Others took the lesson more simply. They added stone behind their stoves, or filled iron pots with water and set them near the heat, or built clay banking around their fireboxes to absorb and release warmth. They were all doing the same thing Ragna's father had shown her in a kitchen in Norway, putting heat into mass so the mass could give it back when the flame was gone. The application varied. The principle did not. Niels asked her once, late in the evening after Sigrid was asleep and the cabin was quiet and the shell was ticking softly as it cooled, what she thought would have happened if the January blizzard had come 2 weeks earlier before the system was fully tested. I would have fired everything I had and trusted the water, Ragna said. And if the water wasn't enough, then I would have failed. But I would have failed trying something new instead of failing the same way everyone else failed. That was always the difference. Not that I was smarter, that I was willing to be wrong in a different direction. Niels considered this. Your blacksmith taught you that? My father taught me that. Aslak taught me how to do it without killing anyone. She looked at the hammer on the wall. She looked at the split tin can beside it. She looked at the shell on its stone pad, warm and breathing, and she thought about the night she had sat against it in the dark after Aslak died, feeling the cold steel under her hand, and how the steel was always warm now because she had filled it and fired it and maintained it the way he had taught her, and the warmth was his and hers, and the waters all at once, and none of it could be separated from the rest. Within 3 winters of the blizzard of 1888, 9 families within wagon distance of the Tveit claim used some version of Ragna's heat storage method, or the principles behind it. The spread was local, practical, and unremarkable to anyone who was not counting. Ragna was counting. She kept a list in the back of Aslak's seam sketch notebook. Names, claim locations, vessel types, installation dates. 9 families, 9 systems, 9 vents that stayed open because she had shown each operator the split tin can and told them what it meant, Ragna Tveit lived out her life on the same claim she had nearly lost in her first winter. The cabin grew around the original shell the way a tree grows around a fence post. The walls expanded, the rooms multiplied, the workshop filled with tools and patterns, and the accumulated evidence of 30 years of teaching. But the shell stayed where it was, on the stone pad Ragna and Eli had hauled from the creek bed, with the hammer above it, and the tin can beside it, and the chalk marks from the first seam test still visible if you knew where to look. Visitors in later years noticed those two things first, the hammer and the tank. They were always warm, or recently warm, or about to be warm. They were never decorative. They were never idle. On the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature had fallen from thaw to killing cold in hours, and Peter Moen had stood on the Tveit claim and told a 26-year-old widow with $32 and 1.5 cords of green cottonwood, "When the real cold comes, that trick will kill you and the girl beside you." He said it because he believed it. He believed it because every winter he had survived told him it was true. A small stove, a leaking cabin, a woman alone with a child and no fuel. The arithmetic was fatal, and the arithmetic did not lie. But Ragna Tveit had found a different arithmetic. She had put a fire inside a tank of water and let the water remember what the fire forgot. And on the worst night the prairie had produced in a decade, with the wood gone and the flame dead and the wind screaming through every crack in the walls, the water had kept its promise. Dawn after the blizzard, the fire nearly dead, Eli asleep against the tank-warmed wall, a tin cup of unfrozen water on the floorboards, frost only where the heat could not reach. The prairie still wanted them dead. It just had to wait longer than anyone expected.